Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 123 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Joining me today is Peter Dowding. Peter worked as a solicitor and barrister for many years in Australia, beginning in 1966. He also served in various positions with the Labour Party and was elected to serve as the 24th Premier for Western Australia from 1988 until 1990. I invited Peter onto the podcast after reading his newly published book, Secret Agent, Unsung Hero, The Valor of Bruce Dowding. It's the story of his uncle Bruce, who was studying in Paris when Germany invaded and felt the call to contribute in any way that he could. Bruce served in uniform, was captured, escaped, joined the French resistance, and even served at the behest of Britain's MI9. But his life was cut tragically short during the war, as were so many others. Peter has spent years researching his uncle's life and contributions during the war, and I'm excited to discuss those findings with him now. But before we dive into this story, I want to say a big thank you to everyone listening who is also supporting me on Patreon, including James H. and Brian A. Your monthly contributions there help me keep this podcast going week in and week out. As a way of thanking my patrons, I offer a lot of great freebies and promotions, including free and discounted books and products from the Spycraft 101 store. Patrons also get exclusive access to long-form articles of mine that aren't available anywhere else. If you haven't signed up for my Patreon yet, but you want to, just click the link in the show notes on whatever podcast platform you're listening to right now. Peter, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed for having me.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you could make it. Peter, your book was amazing. Honestly, it was a very, very highly detailed look inside the resistance and inside those escape lines that developed in Western Europe during the war. And it's really amazing to me how your Uncle Bruce's life touched on so many important events and so many notable people during his years resisting the occupying German forces.
Yeah, one of the things that was so difficult, I suppose, about researching the life of someone who passed away many years ago was that he was referred to in lots of books, in lots of records, but usually just like a sort of will-o'-the-wisp, that he came in and went out, and who really was he? That was the question that I wanted to answer in the book.
Is that what led you to decide to write it now after all this time?
Well, my father, who was Bruce's older brother, carted around for the whole of his life after the war the letters that Bruce had written to the family in 1938 and 39 after he left Australia. And Bruce formed a part of my father's life that he couldn't ever give up on. And so over the years, when the internet came in particular, I started to do quite detailed research about Bruce's life and times in France after he disappeared. And my father was terribly committed to this history. And I promised one day I'd write the book, but it took a very long time. And unfortunately, after my father had passed away.
Yeah, that is unfortunate. How much of this story do you think that he knew during his lifetime, at least?
Well, we knew a fair bit, and my father had been to Europe very early on after the war and visited some of the people who'd participated in these events. But digging out the background and digging out precisely what Bruce had been doing was a very slow thing. And there were lots of diving, as you would do, I'm sure, diving into archives to find out what the real story had been.
Yeah, you certainly pieced it together from what I've read. It's just a very detailed account of everywhere he went and everyone he worked with and all of that. And I was amazed at how much you were able to find, honestly, because like you mentioned, he only shows up, in passing reference in so many of these books and that sort of thing until you really dug into the whole thing.
Well, we did, and just recently we came back from a trip through the UK and Europe, visiting various places that people were that were interested in this story, and we met so many people who were related to the people in the book. We met people whose fathers were involved with Bruce, whose mothers were involved with the organisation. It's interesting to see how much of the events, how many of the events are still alive in people's minds.
Yeah, I bet that had to be very, like, heartening for you to see that that story has not been forgotten at all, even with all the time that has passed since the end of the war.
You know, W.A. Jordan wrote a poem about what used to be thought of as a Bruegel painting about Icarus, the guy who stuck feathers onto his arms and flew too close to the sun. And in this painting and in the Auden poem, Icarus falls into the sea because his wings melted, but the ploughman goes on ploughing and the ship goes on motoring along without any regard to the little white legs falling into the sea. And I've always
Mm,
thought that Bruce was a bit like Icarus, and we wanted to draw attention to the little white legs falling into the sea.
mm. Wow, that's quite an image, my gosh. Yeah, that's wonderful that you've been able to do that. So, can you take us back to the beginning of Bruce's life then, growing up in Australia, what that was like for him?
Well, Melbourne in Australia in the 1920s was a pretty sedate town. It wasn't a huge city, and it had been only part of a new country since 1900. It had previously been a colony of Britain, but it was a pretty comfortable existence. They were caught up in the depression and were able to survive financially. There were three boys, and they did the sort of thing that three kids did in those days. They played football and they played cricket, and they went to school, and they had a quiet sort of social life, and there was a limited amount of cultural activities that they could participate in. But Bruce, particularly the youngest of the three, called Little Bruce was really interested in art and music and culture, and he excelled in lots of things, including, surprisingly to other people, he excelled in sport, even though he was relatively diminutive in size. So life wasn't too bad. They were safe. They were modest, lower middle class people, and they had the opportunity to get good schooling. And he stayed on at the college where he was at after he graduated and began to teach the boys in that school, eventually doing French at university and teaching French at the school. So his life was pretty middle class and pretty safe and easygoing.
Hmm, okay. So did he, I guess with his language skills, he had an early interest in Paris and in France in general?
He did. He really got into what Paris might be like, and there were a lot of newspaper articles then circulated about Paris and the modern art and language and cultural activities in Paris, the cafes and so forth. And Bruce persuaded his boss at the college to give him a half a year's salary in advance if he would go to be permitted to go to France and do a short course at the Sorbonne in French to improve his French. And he got the gig for that, much to his parents' absolute horror. He was his mother's little boy, and she and my grandfather were terribly opposed to his going to Europe in 1938 when international affairs were so fraught.
Yeah, that was gonna be my next question was, like, did he not see what was coming? Because I thought that by that point, it was fairly clear in international media and everything. So did he simply I mean, do you think his motivation was to get there and come back before anything happened, or did he just not care that war was on the horizon potentially?
Look, I don't think he cared. He was more interested in going to France than he was about the risks attached to it. And his mother, I guess as a 23, 24-year-old, that's not surprising. And his mother was absolutely distraught about it, and she was terribly upset. And almost every letter he wrote back, and he wrote back every week to his mother and father, almost every letter repeated the promise that he would return as soon as he'd finished his course, a promise that he broke when he was over there.
Yeah, so he boarded that ship in 1938, and that was the last time anyone in the family saw him. Is that right?
That's right. My father was sent to escort him to Sydney, which was about a day's journey on a train to catch the boat. And my father and he were in Sydney for a couple of days, and then Bruce caught the vessel to Noumea, the French vessel. He said goodbye to my father, and that was the last any member of the family saw him.
Oh man, that had to be so awful. Even with him writing, and they thought everything was fine. I guess for a while, and it was fine. But that had to be such a bitter pill for the whole family to swallow.
It was,
And
and the letters weren't entirely honest. I mean, we know because he also wrote side letters to my father. He was writing letters to his mum saying everything's fine, I'm doing really well, and to my father he'd write, I'm really short of money. Have you got 10 quid you could lend me? So there was a double reality for him. But once he got to France, he found that the transition a bit difficult for a couple of months and didn't fit in too well. And then finally, by about April of 1938, he'd met up with an avant-garde painter called Max Bilder and a couple of other people in the art world. And Max had a very pretty sister, and he met up with her. So life in Paris began to look very attractive.
okay, so he kind of met his expectations ultimately. I mean, there must have been some culture shock when he arrived, even with his French linguistic ability already.
Well, there's a story that he got off the boat in Noumea to test his French on the first bloke that he met. And the fellow didn't understand, just shook his shoulders and walked off. And he said to one of the crew members, I hadn't thought that my French was so bad. And the crew member said, I'm sorry, that bloke's a deaf mute.
Oh wow, what an introduction. Okay, well that must have been heartening. At least it wasn't what he thought it was.
It wasn't, but he did improve his French pretty rapidly, and he was very good at linguistics. So by about the middle of 1938, he'd really settled into Paris. He loved the art, he loved the culture, he loved the cafe life, he loved the people he met, and he was bowled over by Europe, which was so different from the sort of middle class, rather boring Melbourne, Australia.
Oh, sure, yeah, the center of the world, it would seem like to almost anybody coming from anywhere else, I would imagine. So, did his plans change even before the war began? Was he thinking of, not going back after a quick, few semesters at the Sorbonne?
Well, he dilly-dallied, to be honest. I don't think by the end of 1938, I don't think he'd intended to come back to Australia and was going to hang out in France as long as he could. And he got a job at a school in Loches in the Loire area of France, very pretty, very cold at that time, but it was a surviving job. He was able to get looked after and do a few jobs on the side, teaching people and making a few bob. He was struggling financially, but he was loving it. And then when the summer came, he got involved with a family of a professor of Slavic languages and his wife, who was an author. He really got terribly attracted to France. And it was about that time, it's clear, that he formed the view that he wouldn't come back and he would stay in France and help the French against whatever happened later that year. And as we know, what happened was that the Germans indicated they were going to invade.
Yeah, yeah, of course. So, he made was there any particular catalyst, or was he already just kind of committed to France and the French cause even before the Germans entered the country?
Well, interestingly enough, we've got a postcard. I was given the original of this postcard when I was in France 3 weeks ago, and it's a letter it's a note on a postcard in tiny French writing that he wrote to Professor Maison, the head of the family that he was staying with, and explained that he felt totally committed to France, and he felt that he didn't know what contribution he could make to France in the coming difficulties, but he was determined to stay. And that was a conflict because he had committed to his mum and dad that he would return. And it was clear by about October that he wasn't going to go back to Australia.
How did he break the news to them? Did he kind of string them along for a while, or was he very clear that I'm here to stay for the time being?
No, he strung them along for a while, and then they, in a bit of a panic, rustled up the money for his return ship fare to Australia, and they sent it to him. And he wrote a letter saying, I'm sorry, I've got to tell you that I've joined the armed forces as an interpreter. I'm not coming back. I'm not permitted to leave. I'm going to stay the course. And I think that was a sort of an excuse for the reality, and the reality was that he'd intended to stay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's amazing that he, as a foreigner, would decide that this was, if not his home, this was a place worth fighting for, potentially dying for. I do remember a line, I don't remember which specific letter it was, but it really struck me. At some point, he wrote that he felt that up until then, his life had been too easy, if you recall that, and he needed a challenge, which I think is something that a lot of people subconsciously realize, but they don't, they might not be able to articulate it until that challenge is right there in front of them.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the reality as we can determine it now is that for most of 1939, he was broke. He was really living from hand to mouth to survive when he wasn't with the Maison family who'd given him accommodation in return for some English lessons. He really was in hard times, and I can't prove it, but I'm pretty sure that he was sleeping rough from time to time.
Oh, wow. Like out on the street or in a vehicle or something, or?
I don't know. I think the vehicle would have been a luxury. I think I think it might have been under the bridges of Paris, frankly, but it was certainly very tough.
Dang. Well, then a cause comes along that he can get behind, and he's got that. I guess the linguistics was his main contribution at first, the French and the English.
Yeah, well, he'd learned French. He spoke French like a Frenchman. He'd also learned Spanish and French, so he could translate between Spanish and French. When he joined the army, he joined as an interpreter in the British Army, but he found that terribly boring, really. But he was stuck with it until the Germans invaded and overran the Brits.
Okay, so what's the timeline there? Like, how long was he an interpreter for? He was like a uniformed service member at that time already. He was an enlisted soldier as an interpreter.
Yes, he was. He joined up in November 1939, and they were overrun, I think, in April 1940.
Okay, I see. I got it. And then he was taken prisoner at some point, wasn't he?
Yep, they were overrun, and he wrote a letter from the prisoner of war camp explaining what had happened. They'd been overrun by the Germans. Their officer had surrendered. They were made prisoners of war, marched around France until they found a stable prisoner of war camp where they were incarcerated for a while.
Okay, and he was treated like reasonably well at the beginning, was he not?
Look, it's not clear, really. Things were pretty rough. Things were pretty chaotic. I know that for a while he got a job in a bakery in the prisoner of war camp, but he escaped by about May or June of that year by crawling out through a sewer initially. And then finally, when he was recaptured, he just walked out pretending to be a French workman.
Oh, my gosh. It's gutsy.
Oh, look, he was gutsy at home and he was gutsy at school. There's a wonderful little piece about the Wesley College when he was a student. He'd been kept out of the first football team because he was too small, but they ran short of a player one day and he went in and was very gutsy. The newspaper actually reported that little Bruce had been called into the side and unexpectedly had scored the goals. So he was a very gutsy guy, and it was gutsy. It was gutsy to escape at that time in the sense that prisoners of war were not treated terribly well, but they were not treated badly, and they were at least relatively safe from the war that was going on around them.
Yeah, he was essentially escaping back into more danger afterwards, as I'm sure we're going to discuss in a few minutes.
He was. He
So, how did
was.
he find his way to the resistance after that?
Well, he made his way south. I suspect because there's a blank in our chronology, which makes me think that he hung around the Loire area where he knew people and who certainly would have put him up and looked after him. And then he made his way to Marseille, and in Marseille he met the Reverend Donald Caskey, who was a Scottish Presbyterian minister, Church of Scotland minister, who had taken over the Seamen's Mission building in Marseille to help accommodate escaping servicemen. And he and Bruce formed a very close friendship very quickly, partly because my father was also a Presbyterian minister, and Caskey, in his autobiography, records how much pleasure he got out of meeting Bruce and spending time with him. And at that point, I think Caskey and Bruce started to initiate a process for getting escapees out of France and south towards the Pyrenees. And that really is the birth of the escape route that became known as the Pat line.
Amazing. It's so shocking to me that like a guy like him, he would figure out a route along with these others. He would figure out a way to escape the conflict zone and get to safety, and he wouldn't take it for himself. He would stay to maintain that line and get others out instead.
That's right. And the Brits had put together the organisation called MI9, which was a branch of MI5 and MI6 and SOE. And it didn't have any form or structure, but it was trying to get money into the area to help maintain an escape route and to help evaders get out of France. And they had lots of efforts to get money into that area. And Bruce was part of that organisation to form a structure to get people out of France. And as you say, he didn't take that opportunity himself. He was part of the group that was hanging in there to get people on the road back to safety, and importantly for airmen particularly, back to active service, because the government had spent so much money training these people that they were desperate to get them back again.
Yeah, that was a really interesting point that it makes perfect sense, but I hadn't really given it consideration. But just there was a more significant investment in these pilots than just about anybody else, so they had to be the highest priority because there just weren't many men to replace them with as much of a significant air war was going on at the time.
That's right. I mean, it wasn't, I'm not saying it was the priority of the people on the ground. It was certainly the priority of MI9 to get those people out and over the Pyrenees. Initially, they thought they'd be able to use boats to get people out from the south of France, but that only worked for a little while. Very soon it became impractical. So it was a hard slog over the mountains to get out.
So what was his ability besides the linguistics that you mentioned, the language capability? Was there anything else about him that made him valuable to these organizations? I mean, he was willing and he was there, but did he have any other skills or did he require training, something like that?
Well, he completely passed as a Frenchman, and that was the biggest and most important aspect that he could, once he had false papers, he could move around and evade, inquiries that the police and security services imposed on people moving around. So he was also, looking back on it, he was a bit like my dad. My father was a good organiser and pretty brave sort of bloke. So I don't think Bruce had many inhibitions about getting in and doing stuff to achieve the objective. All the people who met him found him charming and interesting and brave. There was a famous Australian woman called Nancy Wake who became known as the White Mouse. She met him in Marseille, speaks lovingly of what a marvellous bloke he was, and so did all the other people who came into contact with him. So he was a doer, a charmer, and a smart operator, and he was exactly what was needed at that point of time in the south of France.
That's fantastic. Yeah, just amazing. The guy was in the right place at the right time with the right mindset and characteristics anyway to do his part. Well, I shouldn't even say do his part because it really wasn't his fight in so many ways, but he decided he was there and he was going to contribute no matter what.
That's right. And of course, the linguistics issue would have been terribly important and was as it developed. We have told in our story, Secret Agent, Unsung Hero, we've told part of the story that the British historians have tried to ignore because in reality, the British during the war were terrified that Franco would come into the war on the side of the Germans. And so they did everything to make sure that they didn't cause his ire, including misstating history by forgetting the important role that the Republicans who were chucked out of Spain at the end of the Civil War, who were milling around the south of France, the important role they played in helping the escapees get over the Pyrenees. A lot of the British historians talk about them as smugglers and crooks, basically criminals, but they weren't. And the group that Bruce worked with, Ponzan Vidal and his organisation, were actually dedicated to try and raise money to go back and attack Franco. And Ponzan Vidal was not a crook or a smuggler, he was a lawyer. Now, some people might say that's the same thing, but as a lawyer, I disagree with them.
Yeah, those guys absolutely left their mark. I know that you talked about him quite a bit in your book as well. And so how closely did he work with Bruce?
Well, we know now that he was, that Ponzan Vidal and his organisation were absolutely critical to a number of groups. They were critical to the British who were trying to get the escapers and evaders over the hill, and they were critical to the American group, Varian Fry's group, who were trying to get intellectuals and artists and musicians over the Pyrenees and out to safety. So Ponzan Vidal and his organisation were vital to both those sections of the community who were trying to escape.
Interesting. So obviously this was all very, very dangerous work and it was having to be done kind of like right under the noses of the Germans. So how long was he able to keep up with this line that he was helping people get out in?
Well, he kept going right through 1940 and 1941. Many of the people involved either escaped or were arrested and jailed, particularly the British Army groups who'd been participating. They were caught up and imprisoned by Vichy France. And Germany increasingly imposed great restrictions in Vichy France and had considerable security service activity in the south of France. So by 1941, it became a pretty fraught activity, and they were quickly formulating a system of getting people down from the north of France, the occupied zone, into the Vichy zone and then out over the Pyrenees. In about May or June 1941, a guy called Icarus, who was a Belgian security officer, he took over formal responsibility for the line, and Bruce worked with him and set up most of his time in Perpignan and Toulouse, doing the liaison with the Spanish separatists for guides to take people over the hill.
If you're looking for another discreet way to carry survival or emergency gear, look no further than the new Covert Mark I briefs from Sotira Systems. The Mark Is feature thigh pockets on either side, large enough for a phone, radio, passport, or other documents. The waistband contains 9 slots for small items such as handcuff keys, SD and SIM cards, padlock shims, and the like. The elastic band keeps them snug but accessible. The Covert Mark Is are designed with comfort and utility at their core and are manufactured from high-grade wicking and fast-drying sports fabric. They can easily replace a traveler's belt pack, which is far more likely to be stolen from you during a robbery than the briefs you're wearing. Covert Mark I briefs are configurable and suitable for anyone in law enforcement, military service, or even the security-conscious global traveler. Find them at sotirasystems.co.uk. That's SOTEIRA systems.co.uk, or at the link in the show notes of this episode, and use the discount code SPYCRAFT101 to save 10% off your order. Oh, wow. Okay. And do you have an estimate on how many people the Pat line safely got out of country?
Well, they talk in terms of hundreds and possibly thousands by the time the Pat line finished in about 1943. But they were also, this American group were getting hundreds of intellectuals and Jews out from south of France. So between them all, we are talking about thousands of people.
Okay, that's amazing. Were they going like one every day, or were they sending people in small groups trying to get, slip them through into the Pyrenees?
A bit of both, mainly groups, trying to get groups over. And of course, it depended very much on the time of year, because in winter, the Pyrenees is pretty formidable. There are some terrible stories of people not making it over the top of the mountains because of the terribly cold weather and the heavy snows.
I can imagine. Yeah, it just seems like the odds are so stacked against them, because I know that German counterintelligence in France was pretty good. They rolled up a lot of people, and you've got this very, very arduous journey to go through, and the active fighting in some areas, I would imagine. So, must have been a horribly stressful, day to day for everyone involved in running the Pat line.
I think it was a very, very stressful. And I don't know, there's a Netflix series that came out recently called Transatlantic Crossing, which is about the American group who was in the south of France trying to get the intellectuals out. America hadn't entered the war at that stage. It didn't enter until December 1941. So they were trying to get people out, and there was a tremendous resistance to that as well, that they were working where some of the American officials were not giving them much support. So even they were faced with problems of people being arrested and being jailed. So it was a very tough time, and I'm sure it was a very stressful time, and Bruce was an important part of the organisation, which was affecting the escape efforts of so many of these people.
Yeah, it's really amazing. It really is hard to imagine just how long this conflict stretched out, because here in America, even though we know better, we kind of subconsciously think of the war beginning in December of 1941, because that's when we got involved. But really, I mean, Bruce had been at it, and so many people had been at it for 2 years at that point
Yeah,
in
that's right.
horrible conditions. So I don't know how they kept it up, honestly.
That of course is the other thing that we've got to remember, is that the conditions for the ordinary French people were pretty tough. There was a very heavy accent on food shortages. There was a huge shortage of money. There were people being deported. The pressure on the Jewish community had been increased by Germany on the Petain government exponentially, and many Jewish people were being rounded up and put into concentration camps, even in the south of France. And so, with that and the food rationing that was going on, and the inability for people to clothe and feed themselves, let alone escapers and evaders, it became very difficult indeed.
Yeah, yeah, what a situation. So, can you tell me a little bit about this guy Paul Cole that kind of figured in so significantly towards the end?
Well, his name was actually, his nom de guerre was Paul, but his real name was Harold, and he was a British sergeant who'd been in jail in Britain before the war as a petty criminal. And when he went to France, he'd actually stolen the sergeant's mess tin. He'd been arrested for that, and then he'd shot through when the Germans invaded, and he'd hid up in the north of France. And he was a con man, and he found a woman to live with whose husband was French and in the war. And he sort of helped organise the beginnings of the pipeline to get people out of northern France. I think he saw the opportunity to make some money in doing it. And so he organised a couple of young fellas to take, as couriers, to take some of the evaders down south to Marseille. And he himself went down a couple of times. And by late 1941, he had been entrusted with money to go north and help the people who were looking after the escapees, and he pinched it. And he was called down for a reckoning in Marseille, at which he was basically punched in the face by the head of the organisation, and they discussed whether or not they'd kill him. Cole ran off, and after that, someone had to go north and try and warn people and help sort it out. And Bruce was delegated to do that. So he went from the Vichy zone to the northern zone, which was made up of two areas. One was the occupied area, called the occupied zone, and the other was the forbidden zone, which you need a special pass to get in and out of. And Bruce was having to go across both those zones at the end of 1941. And when he was getting the organisation back on its feet, Cole went back up north and was arrested by the Gestapo and spilt the beans, if you like, and went round identifying about 100 people in the organisation, all of whom were arrested and imprisoned immediately. And Bruce was one of them.
My gosh. Was he was he like a collaborator for them after he was kicked out, or was it truly all like, torture and giving it up against his will, you think?
Well, we've got a statement from the guy who was the interpreter at his interrogation, at Cole's interrogation, and he said they couldn't stop Cole talking. He wasn't under any pressure, and he just simply went round with the Gestapo fingering the people who'd been with him, and they took him down to Paris to do the same thing, and he did again exactly that, and then he eventually walked off from the Gestapo and eventually was caught up a year later when he started to work with the Gestapo, and he worked with them till the end of the war.
Wow. So he stole the money, he was kicked out of the organization, and then he decided that he was the wronged party here, and so he just gave up everybody else in the whole organization after that.
He gave up everybody else over time, including Bruce, and they were all put into a prison in Lille. But there were a couple of things that happened then, and the first was that the Germans passed a law called Nacht und Nebel, NNN, and it basically said that anyone who was guilty of subversive activity in an occupied zone would be taken to Germany, deported to Germany, and would disappear and would never be seen again by any of their relatives or Red Cross or anything. They would just disappear. And so they were given a number. They were deported to Germany, and they were kept in prison, pretty ghastly conditions, through 1942. And early 1943, they were tried and sentenced to death.
How was Bruce picked up exactly was, were they aware that the Gestapo was closing in on them at that time, or was it totally out of the blue once they'd been identified?
No, they were aware they were closing in. In fact, Bruce was in the house of one of the people that he was working with, who was a priest, Abbe Pierre Carpentier, and his special role had been to falsify passes so that people could get over the Somme River between the occupied zone and the forbidden zone, and also to move intelligence out over the Pat line. And Bruce was actually in the house when Cole came to Pierre Carpentier and the Gestapo arrested him, and Bruce hopped it over the back fence. So he knew that things were going bad, and he went round the north trying to warn people to be very careful. He got off the train at Burberry Station, and Cole was there to meet the train, thinking that it was Garis coming up from the south of France. But Bruce stepped off the train, and Cole identified him to the Gestapo, and Bruce was arrested.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. What terrible luck. So he was taken back to Germany and sentenced to death at that point, you said?
Yeah, he was. They were kept in prison for a couple of months. Then they were deported via Brussels to Germany, and they were held at Bochum prison. Now that was a terrible situation. Firstly, the prison conditions were absolutely appalling, and we know that from a couple of people who survived it. And secondly, the Allies began bombing Bochum very heavily during 1943. But Bochum was on the edge of the Ruhr Valley, which was the big industrial zone of Germany. And the Allies were bombing it incessantly. A lot of the bombs fell on civilians and on the prisons, and many prisoners were killed in those bombing raids. So the conditions in Bochum were very bad indeed. In fact, my wife and I were in Bochum 6 weeks ago and talking with people who'd been there, so we know how awful it was. And then when they were sentenced to death, they were held in the Bochum prison until it was time for their execution, and they were taken to Dortmund prison.
Okay, so was it other people with Paul at that time from the Pat line, or was it a bunch of just other convicts that he'd been lumped in with?
No, Bruce was with a number of 9. There were 9 people from underground organisations that were executed that night, of whom 6 and Bruce were all part of the Pat line.
Oh, man, so he's right there with his companions to the very end.
He was right there with his companions, and in particular, the man who'd become his dear friend, who was Abbe Pierre Carpentier. They were executed between 7 o'clock and 7:30 that night.
Okay, so this was, do I remember correctly, it was early 1944 by the time that his sentence was carried out?
No, it was the 30th of June, 1943.
43. Okay, I see. My gosh, yeah, still so much time to go. They couldn't have known it, of course, but so much time left in that conflict. So how were the sentences carried out? Was it hanging?
No, there was a special guillotine developed by the Germans called a Fallbeil, and it was a very relatively small and semi-portable machine. They were held behind a curtain in a line, and they were taken from behind the curtain, strapped to the sort of cross on the machine, which was tilted over, and the blade took the head off, and then the next person came in.
Man, thing is still, yeah, oh my gosh, it's hard to imagine, people despair. I guess it takes 3 or 4 minutes for every prisoner. So just one after the other, like an assembly line almost into the guillotine.
It was. And we know something about this because behind the process, there had been a priest to the prison, and he had secretly kept notes of the names of the prisoner, which he was not permitted to do. But he kept notes of the prisoners' names and had a few moments of speaking to them before they were executed. And after the war, he wrote to many of their families, including my family in Melbourne, to tell them what had happened because they were absolutely unaware of it.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, they're so far removed from the conflict zone. So, how did they find out what happened to Bruce? I mean, I take it he probably was not able to correspond very much while he was a member of the resistance, right?
That's right, and it wasn't until after the war, 1947, that they found out what had happened to him. The war was well and
47.
truly over. 47.
Wow. So, he left in 1938. And
Yep.
my gosh. So, it was almost 10 years before they truly knew what happened to him after the last time they saw him.
That's right. And after the war, the best that the British War Office was able to say was that he was missing in action, believed dead.
Hmm. Yeah, I have to. I mean, I can't imagine the work that goes into that, even once peace has broken out, to try to clean up and make sense of everything that had happened over the past 7 years. So tremendous amount of work. But I know that was no comfort to the family when they're just months and months and then years and years going by with no word from him.
That's right, and my father in particular had been delegated by the family to make the inquiries, and he was doing it incessantly to organisations and people trying to find out what had happened. They made contact with people in France, and they didn't know what had happened. They made contact with the Red Cross. They had no idea. They made contact with the War Office. They had no idea. They believed that he was dead, and it wasn't until they really got this letter from the priest, Father Steinhoff, in 1947. He wrote a letter which was addressed in an envelope, Family Dowding, Melbourne, Australia. It made it to them, and it explained that Bruce had died, how he'd died, and that he'd been very brave, and that Steinhoff had actually converted him to Catholicism moments before his
Hmm.
death.
Oh wow. I guess by 1947 they could not have been surprised that he died. But I mean, was it a relief to get that letter, or was it like horrible, sickening realization that he had been executed by the Germans, or what do you think?
That's a very interesting question. I think it was I think it was a relief to know what had happened, but of course a tragedy. And even then, they didn't really know what he'd been doing. They didn't know how all of this had come about. And there is a state of Australia, your listeners may not be familiar. There's a state in Australia, a little island on the bottom east coast called Tasmania. And in one of the Tasmanian newspapers, a very small state, it's got a couple of 100,000 population, they had an article which had been circulated from overseas, from the British newspapers, in which the head of the PAT organisation, Greece, had written 4 short articles about the PAT line. And in that, he'd mentioned Bruce's contribution, and that was sent to
Hmm.
the family in Melbourne, which was the first time they actually knew that what Bruce had been involved in, and up until then it had been a mystery.
Oh, okay. So the things kind of filter out over the many oncoming years after that. So I mean, you were the first person to dedicate a whole book to Bruce. I mean, did and you uncovered a lot of new information yourself in your own research, didn't you?
We certainly did. My father, in 1949, my father took a job in Scotland, which meant taking me and my mother to Scotland to work with the Church of Scotland there. And in part, I think his motivation was to get near Europe, where he could go and try and find out more about Bruce's life. And when he was in Scotland, he went to Germany and met with Father Steinhoff, the priest, and met with a couple of other people who'd been involved with Bruce. So he began to fit together some of the story, but really none of the family knew as much as we know now. And that's really been 30 or 40 years of research to try and, not full time, but from time to time, trying to dig out the truth of what had happened.
Yeah, that's such a shame, I swear. And it's so wonderful that you were able to put all this together with your research. But I can tell you that, every story that we cover here on the podcast is different. But one thing that almost all of them have in common is these lingering unanswered questions. And, my heart really goes out to the people that are left asking why and what happened, afterwards. And so many of them never get a satisfactory answer to those questions. It's really tragic, honestly.
That's very true, and the remarkable thing about the internet and the remarkable thing about COVID, many of the British archives and the French archives opened up with free access to digitised material during COVID because people couldn't go to their archives. I regret to say that your country didn't do the same, and it would have been lovely. It would have been lovely to get some access to the NARA archives about some of these things, but there certainly was a heap of material that came out over the years from the internet, and then of course meeting and talking to people either live or on Zoom or in email has been so instructive and so wonderful, so absolutely fabulous to meet people who've been involved in either research or in life with these people has been really exciting and
Mhm.
stimulating.
I can imagine. I can imagine. Yeah, it is really great. That is one of the great things about how connected we are now is because it's 80 years since Bruce died. 80 years and yet his story is still being told, his story is still being discovered. As a matter of fact, by you and by others, which is really amazing. So he really lives on long, long, long past that execution date in so many important ways.
Justin, it's absolutely correct. And if I tell you that I was born the same year, you'll know something about my age.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I get it. So were you is your birth date after June? Had he already
Yeah,
been executed before you were born in that case?
yeah. He
Okay, so he
disappeared. Yeah, my cousin who
yeah.
was born the year earlier, he was named Bruce, called Bruce Dowding.
Oh, wow.
The fact is that this has been an elephant in the room of the Dowding family for the last 85 years. I can tell you
Hmm.
that. So it's really wonderful to get a book out from the point of view of having it out and having said it. I hope people enjoy it, but it's wonderful for me and my family to actually have it out there now.
Yeah, yeah, I can certainly imagine how that would be. And I realize that there is a huge amount of pain, especially for his parents and for your father, of course. But it's hard to have a better legacy than saving hundreds of lives during the worst war in the history of the world. You know what I mean? Bruce gave there couldn't be a better contribution almost than what he gave during his short lifetime.
That's very true, and I mean a lot of people in the army and the navy and the air force and in underground organisations. I mean they all made their contribution, and I'd hate anyone to think that we were trying to paint Bruce as some special angel, but it just emphasises how many people made such a fantastic effort and putting their own lives at risk for a better world.
Hmm. Yeah, no doubt about it. So, were his parents, your grandparents, ever able to travel to Europe and see his grave, or any other members of the family able to go there besides yourself?
Other than my father, no, none of the others
Hmm.
did. My grandmother died very, very soon after Father Steinhoff's letter. My grandfather lived until the 1960s. He never went to Europe. He never found that he could talk about these things. My father went to Europe and saw Bruce's initial grave, which was just a wooden cross. And then later on, after he'd retired, he went and saw Bruce's grave in the Cleve War Graves area in Germany. I've certainly been there a couple of times in journeys remembering Bruce, which we've made quite a few.
Okay, yeah, that's wonderful. Like I mentioned before we started recording too, I've bookmarked that cemetery as well for the next time that I'm in Europe. So if I get anywhere close, I will go and visit myself. Honestly, it's wonderful to talk about. And of course, I didn't know anything about Bruce until I found your book, but now myself and the listeners here are learning his story as well. So he does continue to live on in your cousin's name and in the book that you've written as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Justin. That's good of you.
Absolutely. So, do you think that for his parents, for your grandparents, was this a legacy where they felt like it was something that they wished that he had never gone over, or did they kind of come to terms with it eventually, how he left and decided that, he was going to be a part of that fight as well, even if it never brought him home?
But personally, I think my grandparents, I don't know about my grandmother. I think she was just so enveloped in the tragedy of his loss that she couldn't even talk about it. Probably
Mm,
true of my grandfather. In terms of my father, he and his older brother, both of them were shocked by the loss. It's hard to express it because there were millions of people who had that sort of loss. But for them
mhm,
personally, it was a deeply unhappy situation to have lost their favourite youngest brother.
mm, mhm. Yeah, I mean, you're right that there were millions of stories that were similar but different at the same time from that conflict, and just a enormous amount of loss in such a short period of time is really horrifying.
Is it certainly is, and been to France, where we're particularly in areas like the Somme, where people were bombed in the First World War and bombed in the Second World War. That now there are people coming from Ukraine, and there'll be people coming from Israel and Palestine and so on. So it's a continuum, a tragic continuum, really.
Yeah, it really is. It's such a I hate to use the word normal, but it's such a continuing and regular facet of human existence. Really, is conflict, and there is a enormous amount of tragedy and loss associated with all that. And it's so much more than just numbers on the nightly news or something like that. When you hear these individual stories and how it affects a family for decades upon decades, the loss of just a single member of the family can really change the course of their lives in so many ways.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true.
Oh, okay. Well, Bruce, thank you so much. This has been really informative, and I love the book. Like I said, for the listeners, if you want to pick it up, the book is called Secret Agent, Unsung Hero: The Valor of Bruce Dowding. And I just read it. I think it's about to be published here in the U.S. very soon, isn't it, Peter?
I think it is, and it's available on Apple Books and shortly to be on Kindle, I think, as well.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, it's well worth the read if you have any interest at all in the French Resistance, because it's not just the story of Bruce, it's the story of like the entire network that he worked with and all the places he went and so many of the people that were involved as well. So it's very enlightening for me to see what the conditions were like in occupied France at that time, and it's well worth a read for sure. Bruce, are you working on anything else now that this is published? Have you moved on to any other projects?
I think my wife would have a complete fit if I started another project.
Oh,
It's taken a lot out of us, this book, and it's wonderful to have it completed. I might dream of one, Justin, but I'm not sure.
okay. Well, I'll certainly be paying attention if you do come up with anything else. I promise, Peter.
Thank you very much indeed.
Absolutely. Do you have like a public facing social media pages or anything like that you can share if people want to follow along?
We've got a social media page called Peter Dowding Author, one word. And if anyone is interested about specifics, I've got an email address which was pdowding1@gmail.com. Happy to
Okay.
answer any questions that people might have.
Okay, great. That's Peter Dowding, author, on Facebook, isn't it?
Peter Dowding Author on Facebook. Yep, that's it.
Okay, great. Yeah, we'll link that up in the show notes as well so people can find you after they hear the episode. Well, thanks again, Peter. This has been really informative, and I certainly appreciate your time, and I loved reading about Bruce.
Thank you very much, Justin, and regards to you and your listeners.
Absolutely. Take care. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer: this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.